So I'll give you my fancy title. What we're really trying to do in plainer words is trying to use data to make decisions and document change on dairies and in the industry. I'd like to argue that to really do that, we need to take hoof trimmer records that are currently separately recorded, separate from our currently integrated data framework that gives you genetic evaluations, and kind of integrate them, but do that integration at the farm level. And this is kind of what we're proposing to do, what we're working on and working towards. With that integrated framework, we can then start making decisions on dairies, but also making decisions on dairies and providing transparency and increase the sustainability of the industry. This is my conflict of interest statement, so everybody's aware. I do run a separate consulting business outside of University of Minnesota, or outside of Minnesota. So these are people that have given me money in addition to the CDBC support. So this everybody's aware. So for the presentation today, I'd like to discuss the why. Why are we doing this? Why do I think this is important? How we're planning to do this, and then the opportunities and the outcomes of the project. And there's many different outcomes that we're working towards. I'm going to highlight some of them, not a lot of detail, but hopefully there'll be questions and we can get into a bit more detail about those things. One of the reasons I think we need to start thinking about this integrated framework is that consumers are starting to expect this, and they know some of this already. So this is an example of a retailer in the UK that every year publishes the lameness prevalence of their farm. So this is data from 9 years that they put out on the internet and saying this is what our farms are doing with relation to lameness. Currently, I'm not aware of this happening in the US yet, but I'll show you some stuff that might be coming, right? But if we think about this, it probably doesn't take a stretch to say, okay, what do consumers think about this? Is this appropriate? Is this an appropriate level of lameness? Is this acceptable? And then in the future with automation, I foresee a future where this is going to be available at the farm level. So a supplier could say, hey, on farm X, this is what the current lameness prevalence is, or the lameness incidence is. Is that appropriate? Are we going to take your milk? So this is, consumers know that this is happening and they're requesting it. And I think this is going to become more prevalent. The other thing, so this might sound far-fetched, but last month, there was kind of an official launch of a company called Viola, was supported by Nestle and Land O'Lakes, so big players in the retail market. And this is stuff that's taken directly from their website, right? And if you look at just the consumer part, consumers can see where their food comes from, how it's produced, and what impacts it's having on sustainability and the environment, right? And the reason for this is people are doing this because they're loyal to that. They think, okay, this brand is doing an appropriate job with sustainability, animal welfare, all those things. But the premise of this company is to have data flow from the farm so that in theory, a consumer could pull up the farm and say, oh, this is where my product came from. This is, for example, what the lameness levels would be on that farm, right? So this is the world we're heading towards. And I think as an industry, we need to be ready for this and have the right data in front of people and not data that's has several problems associated with it, right? The other thing is we've set some expectations for ourselves, which I think is a good thing. But if we look at the net zero initiative, we have set an initiative to become carbon neutral, right? So net zero, we're trying to be zero by 2050. Well, you might think, well, what role does lameness have in that? Well, if you think about it, right, cows that are lame produce less milk than they're capable of, have a shorter lifespan, so decreased longevity. And just by improving some of those aspects with this initiative, we can contribute it to the net zero initiative. The other expectation we've set is through our welfare assessment. So in the US, the farm program has set a standard that there's less than 5% of cows that are severely lame. I would argue that standard's likely going to change and people are going to start requesting, is this an appropriate standard? And I think we need better methodology or better standards or better ways to assess lameness on dairies to work with. And I think this initiative can provide some opportunities to incorporate that and come up with, for example, what's an appropriate lesion prevalence on a dairy, or what's the number of new cases that are happening, right? So because we've set the expectations and, okay, we're taking care of lameness and this is our standard, I think in time, those standards are going to change and probably get tighter. And then we need to be ready and prepared to have appropriate data and be driving that data for the industry to use. Okay, now I want you to switch gears a little bit and just think for yourselves a little bit. We don't have the option to pull stuff, but right, if you think about lameness itself, so assuming digital dermatitis is controlled, what's the biggest bottleneck to having less lameness in the herds you work with, right? I know some of you are industry people, but herds you visit, herds you to look at data from, what do you think the biggest impact is? So I'm going to argue, after I've given you some time to think, that it's finding lame cows. And you might think, well, that's weird because we think about things like housing, cow comfort, flooring, hoof trimming, all those things come together. And if we fix that, we'll have less lame cows. I'm going to argue that finding lame cows is actually probably more important and probably the biggest thing most dairies can start doing tomorrow to reduce the number of lame cows on the dairy, even though we're going to find probably more lame cows. The reason for that is if we think about this 8-cow herd, right? So if we think about this 8-cow herd, everybody can see my cursor, I hope. There's a red line here. This is the time, for example, when the farm assessments is happening. So the animal welfare assessment's happening. On this 8-cow farm, there's 4 cows that are lame currently. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So the lameness prevalence is 50%. If we, through automation or visual observation, start detecting lame cows better and find them earlier, we're going to reduce the duration of disease. And that's what the second bar shows. So if we have our green or dark gray and our light gray, so light gray is the reduction in time that the cow is no longer lame, where she's lame in the gray bar. So now on the same site visit, even though we haven't changed the number of lame cows that have been created, we've reduced the number of lame cows that currently exist at the time of our visit. So if we look at the red line again, now there's only 1 cow that's lame. This cow right here is currently lame in this scenario. So if we take things like automation and add that to our currently existing systems, we can reduce the prevalence of lameness quite quickly just by finding and reducing the duration of lameness, right? On top of that, if we then add genetic evaluation of locomotion or hoof lesions, we could reduce the number of cows that actually get lame in this herd, right? So if we have an 8-cow herd, every cow is getting lame. If through genetic evaluations, we can reduce that in the long term, that adds another layer to it, and we're going to reduce lameness even more. So that's why I think finding lame cows is the biggest thing the industry can do right now. And this initiative should help put some energy on that. So why is that not happening? I think one of them is time consuming. It's very subjective. I've done several different locomotion scoring. I've trained different people. It's very hard to get people to agree on the in-between cases, right? We can split the system up and go to a 5-point or a 3-point or even a 10-point to try and catch those little subtle changes, but it's very subjective, right? And the scores fluctuate between people. So a cow that was a 1 might be a 2 tomorrow and then back to a 1, right? So we need to take care of that. People realize that, and it becomes frustrating to deal with. Right, so I'm going to argue that because of the things I've outlined, it's time for the industry to take action. And this is what we're trying to talk to you about today, right? A step we're taking to try and take all the industry stakeholders, whether it be hoof trimmers, veterinarians, genetic companies, CDBC, camera technology companies, and come up with an initiative to try and drive some of this change and test some of these theories out in the real world. So how are we going to do this? What are we trying to do? Right, so what we're trying to do is trying to create basically an integrated framework or a pipeline of data, right? Where all the data that we currently have. So for example, we have the CDVC data, genetic evaluation data, we have the on-farm data, and then we have the hoof lesion data. We want to put that all together kind of into a framework. Currently, however, what's happening, especially when it comes to the lameness or hoof lesion data, is it's sitting outside this funnel, right? So currently we have a decent process where we can get, for example, daughter pregnancy rate data. We've made progress there, somatic cell count data. There's a framework that makes that flow happen. We don't currently have a framework that's as effective as it should be to have hoof lesion data or other lameness data flow into the system. And that's what we're trying to create, right? And I'm going to argue that to really make this happen, we're going to try to set this up where the data resides on the farm and gets pushed in different directions. Because I would argue that to make the system work and have long-term sustainability, it needs to be available on the farm basically the second the hoof trimmer drives off the site, or if we're using on-farm hoof trimmers, that the manager can look and say, okay, what does trim day look like today? What are some new lesions? And make informed decisions right away, right? So in other countries, this type of system exists, but the data has to flow up and then back down to the farm, and the hoof trimmer has to upload the data, right? So some countries are changing that approach. But having worked with some of those systems, having talked to some of those people, I believe that to make this work long-term, we need to have the data available on the farm right away. And I'm going to show you why I think that is, right? So this is the goal. We're trying to have this pipeline integrated framework where the data resides on the farm and flows in the different directions, but is available basically the second the cow is trimmed. Somebody can pull up a report and say, this is what happens to that specific cow. Because there are times, for example, if I'm a veterinarian by training, so if the vet comes the next day, they should be able to look at hoof lesion data if they know the trimmer was there on Tuesday and it's Wednesday and the veterinarian's there. Same for nutritionists or breeding companies or everything else. That data should be readily available because we can make informed decisions on the dairy that are going to impact the dairy at the farm level, but also at the industry level with this type of framework. Okay, so I keep talking about making decisions based on our data. Okay, what kind of decisions am I talking about, right? So I think for on-farm use, probably the biggest and most wanted thing is to create management lists, right? So and make that process easier. And just to highlight a little bit, I've done some focus groups talking to trimmers, veterinarians and hoof trimmers. And this is something that came up in one of the focus groups that the hoof trimmer said, if we can leave a piece of paper or we print it or out or email it to them ahead in the morning, we give them the sheet for our rechecks. They all love that because it's something less they have to do, right? So I agree that's completely true. However, the question I ask myself is why do they have to leave a piece of paper? Why do they have to print or email it? Why can't they sync it to the farm management software? And when the farm creates their trim list or enters the sorts, those recheck cows are automatically there. And that's where I think this process needs to start and be integrated at the farm level, because then things move forward and there's buy-in from the farm level, right? So this is an example of a recheck list that's automatically generated. The trimmer enters a report. This is an on-farm trimmer, but could also be working with professional trimmers where the data is automatically flowed, recheck dates are set automatically, and we can create these recheck lists. Or we can create lists that ask for further attention cows. So think of this like a high somatic cell count list, right? So this should be automatically created where once a month somebody looks at these high cell count or high lameness cows and say, okay, what are we going to do with this cows? For example, on this dairy, there's a cow that's been through the chute 10 times, right? So with this integrated framework, when the trimmer sends their data to the farm, gets absorbed into the farm management software, one of the KPIs we could be looking at saying, okay, how many cows have repeated lameness cases? Do we really want to breed that cow? Do we really want to do X, Y, Z to this cow? Or should we consider other options for this cow? Does it need veterinary attention? Right, so that's the one thing. Then the next thing we can do with that data, if it's easily available, is monitor their trimming program. There's many things we can look at, but this is just an example, right? So most dairies kind of roughly know I need to trim, let's say on this dairy, 250 cows a month, right? So if we look at the red bars here, month on the bottom, we can quickly see, okay, are we meeting our targets? Similar to how we evaluate reproductive programs, right? We say, okay, our cow's getting bred in a certain time period. We can do the same if we set up the data recording appropriately and the integration appropriately. We can create these same type of reports and we can ask the same type of questions, look at it by days in milk, by lactation, those type of things, right? So that this is where the power resides in having this framework available. Then the next thing, of course, we can look at, okay, what's actually going on with lesions? And this is just an example. There's many reports we can create looking at this, but this is just an example of a dairy where we have this set up where we can create and look at it by month, right? So month again on the bottom, count of the different lesions, and then the different lesions are up here. And we can start saying, okay, what happened here in January? Did we change trimmers? Are we trimming less cows? Is the recording changed? Or is this maybe we made an intervention. We started something new. We started feeding something different, or we changed housing in December. Now we're seeing the impact of that, right? But with this framework and with this data flowing to the farm software, now we can easily evaluate these decisions and make decisions based on it, right? We can also look at this for numerically, of course, right? So I'm a graphical person, but we can also look at it numerically and say, okay, on this dairy, currently, over a year's time, 10% of the cows get digital dermatitis. Okay, so I've given you kind of some basic reports to look at, but we still haven't really said decisions on the dairy, right? So with this framework, what I would argue, we can start asking more specific questions, right? So the dairy can ask, can we stop mid-lactation trims? Or do we change the foot bath, right? So for example, on this dairy, this is a 600-700 cow dairy, and there's maybe 20 cases of digital dermatitis over the whole year's time period, right? So if this data flows appropriately, is recorded appropriately, nobody's typing it in, it's easy to look at this, easy to say, okay, maybe we can make this change. Maybe we drop a frequency. Instead of going to 4 days a week, we're going to go to 3 days a week. And we have a process to monitor the outcome of those interventions. Okay, so that's why I think we need to make and monitor decisions based on data, right? That's at the farm level. And this is why we designed the program, or we're designing the program, or implementing the program like this. Of course, there needs to be things like hoof trimmer billing and industry level programs. So what do those look like? So currently, most of the software that's being used by trimmers, these are kind of the top programs that are out there currently. There's some other ones that are out there too. What's happening with most of them, and it's starting to change a little bit, that this data gets entered into the dairy management software programs, but it gets typed in, right? So somebody prints a list from, for example, this hoof supervisor program, the trimmer prints a list, and then the farm enters all that information, manually types it in. However, there is already a process established where the farm can take a file and have it automatically imported into the different programs, right? Some of these are cloud-based, so it can happen via the cloud too, but that process is starting to exist. The problem is we need to implement this appropriately. For example, I was just talking to a farm yesterday or this week where they said, okay, we implemented the integration, but now we're getting alerts for withdrawals because that are associated with one particular protocol, right? And so to implement this appropriately, we need to involve all the stakeholders, right? So the trimmer, the veterinarian, the farm, and then of course, the bigger industry people too, to say, okay, what are your needs? What do you need the data to look like, right? So it might be different what the genetic company wants, what CDBC wants, what the hoof trimmer, what the veterinarian wants, but we can all put together and say, okay, this is going to meet the needs of our situation. We can't just use the defaults and say, okay, we're going to set up the integration and not change and adapt it to specific protocols on the farm. So we need all stakeholders working together. So this is what the goal, what we're looking for. And this is how we're going to do it, right? So we're going to do an integrated framework, have it work on farm. And it's because it's two-way pipeline. So what are some of the opportunities? Right, so we talked a little bit, if we go back to the beginning of my talk, we talked about welfare audits. I think there's a future where instead of having every 3-year person from the processor comes in and locomotion scores your cows, we can look at your lesion prevalence and say, this is how many lesions you have. Are you making progress? Are things changing? Those type of thing, right? That also becomes more real time, right? So you don't get penalized for a mistake that happened 2 years ago because those cows are still around, and lameness is a pretty chronic disease. Whereas if we look at new lesions, you could have made a change and say, okay, yes, we had more lesions previously, but now we're getting a lot fewer lesions, right? We can also use locomotion for welfare audits, right? Especially if we use automation. Then we can get daily prevalence of lameness. But I would argue more importantly, we can get information about newly lame cows, right? So we might have a standard baseline of 12% from, let's say, the Sainsbury report saying that's the lameness prevalence. But some farms might be creating a lot more newly lame cows, and other farms are just chronic cows that are in the system, but they're not creating a lot of newly lame cows. Which one has the better welfare, right? Those are things we can then decide and use as outcomes, right? Of course, there's genetic evaluations. So I'm an epidemiologist by training. You don't want an epidemiologist talking about genetic evaluations. So Kristen's going to discuss this a little bit further. But I am excited about how we can use this information, right, to make breeding decisions and for long-term change within the industry. Like I showed kind of when we talked about this 8-cow herd, if we can create less lame cows through genetic evaluation, that has a role to play. And then, of course, I'm a researcher, right? So we can use this framework to ask research questions, whether they be descriptive, right? So what's a normal level and impacts, right? So a lot of people, I can create these reports for the farms and this guy, what's normal, what's achievable? And I say, well, this is a rough ballpark of like the best farms I see. But with this framework, we can say, okay, this is what an achievable level of digital dermatitis is, or soil ulcer prevalence or incidence is on your dairy. Plus, then we can also say, okay, what's the impact of these new cases on such things as milk yield or longevity, right? So a lot of studies have been done with that already, but they've all been done in a relatively short time period. Whereas with this framework, we can start looking at cows over a longer time period and say, okay, we look at cows that were never lame and look at their impact on milk production versus cows that are chronically lame, because there are different estimates and different decisions you'd make about them. And then, of course, we can start asking causal questions, right? So a lot of people ask me, do I need to trim twice a year? When should I trim? When's the best time to trim? well, if we have this integrated framework with lots of dairies and information that's being fed into this anonymously, we can then say, okay, these herds are trimming twice a year, these herds are trimming 3 times a year, these cows are getting trimmed, these cows aren't. What's the difference in lameness between them? Right, and taking this a step further, we can start looking at or do follow-up with some of these herds, especially if they're using some sort of automation or different feeding programs or different housing programs, and saying, does this actually reduce lameness, right? So now we have a framework to say, to answer some of these causal questions that are really, really difficult to do using typical randomized clinical control trials, but we can do these using well-designed epidemiological studies. However, we need large numbers of data to make this work. So I think that's the excitement for me and the draw to me for this framework, is we can answer some of these questions that we all want to know. With that, and I see Joe showing up, so I'm out of time. I hope I've kind of given you a sense of where we're trying to head with this program. And I truly believe that if we implement this appropriately, we can start making decisions and use data instead of kind of going by opinion and what one person thinks versus the other.